Date: April 1968. Location: Hong Kong, Kowloon, a single moment that has been buried for years. 7 men were there, but Bruce Lee never spoke about what happened. What they witnessed would shake their understanding of the man they thought they knew. A challenge, more than a fight. The stakes were higher than anyone realized. And what followed changed everything. Year: 1968. Location: Kowloon, Hong Kong. Bruce Lee had already begun to reshape the martial arts landscape by 1968, but his reputation was still in flux. On the one hand, he was gaining recognition in the West, particularly after his brief but impactful role in the Green Hornet. But in Hong Kong, his unorthodox approach to martial arts was raising eyebrows. Lee had broken away from the traditional schools of Kung Fu, rejecting their rigid forms in favor of something more adaptable, more pragmatic, something he called Jeet Kune Do. It was a philosophy more than a style, a rejection of what Bruce saw as outdated dogma. His critics, however, didn't see it that way. To many, Bruce's approach was blasphemous, a dilution of martial arts. At that time, traditional martial arts schools were entrenched in their beliefs, focused on the purity of their forms. Bruce's rejection of this purity made him a target of the martial arts establishment, who considered him a threat to the traditional values they upheld. But despite this opposition, Bruce was gaining fame quickly. He was known as a prodigy, a man who could perform feats of physicality that few others could even dream of, yet the price of fame was the weight of criticism. But his reputation wasn't just controversial, it was also deeply misunderstood. Bruce Lee wasn't trying to abandon tradition. He was trying to refine it. His mission was clear: to create something new, something real, something that worked under the pressure of real-world combat. For him, martial arts had to be about efficiency and adaptability, not about following ancient ceremonial rules. This philosophy made him a pioneer, but also an outcast among the old guard. His message was simple: absorb what is useful, discard what is not, add what is uniquely your own. This wasn't just a martial arts philosophy. It was a direct challenge to every convention that had been established in the world of combat. And in 1968, with all the eyes of Hong Kong's martial arts world on him, Bruce was ready for something more than just the spotlight. He was ready to prove himself in the crucible of real challenge. But there were still some who believed that his approach was nothing more than a flashy gimmick. This was the context when the challenge came. A man named Lin Feng had heard the rumors. He was no stranger to combat, but he was skeptical of Bruce Lee's reputation. A man who can dance with his fists, sure, but can he really fight? Lin thought to himself. Lin wasn't interested in public demonstrations or staged exhibitions. He wanted to see if Bruce Lee could stand up to real combat. And so, the challenge was set. But this was not going to be a fight for fame or glory. This was a test of Bruce's very philosophy. Would he prove that his approach was more than just style? Or would Lin expose it as nothing more than an illusion? As Bruce Lee prepared for this fight, the stakes were not only about his reputation. They were about the entire philosophy he had built. This was more than just about physical dominance. It was a fight for Bruce's very identity in the world of martial arts. If he failed, it would not just be a loss in a fight. It would be a defeat of everything he had worked for. And for Lin, it was a chance to prove that traditional combat still held the real power. Bruce wasn't just facing a man. He was facing the very system he had chosen to challenge. Who he was, Lin Feng wasn't a man who sought attention. Unlike the showy martial artist who competed for fame in Hong Kong's crowded tournament scene, Lin was known in darker circles, those who dealt in underground fights, away from the media's watchful eye. His background was hazy, but the rumors surrounding him were clear. He had fought in countless brawls, both organized and impromptu, where the goal was always the same: survival. He was a former soldier, a man who had spent years honing his instincts in close-quarter combat. Unlike Bruce, who had built his career around the art of structured fighting, Lin's experience was forged in the brutal realities of the street, where every fight was a matter of life or death. He didn't have a flashy pedigree. He didn't need it. The street was his dojo, and the ring was just another battlefield. His weapon wasn't precision or technique. It was sheer survival. Why he was dangerous? Lin was not a man of elegance. His fighting style was raw and brutal, built on practical violence rather than art. He had no respect for the traditional schools of martial arts that govern the fights in Hong Kong, nor did he have any interest in the philosophy that Bruce Lee espoused. To Lin, fighting was simple. It was about dominating your opponent, ending the fight as quickly as possible, and getting out alive. This was what made him dangerous. He didn't care about the rules. He didn't need the formality of a clean fight. Lin had fought in street brawls where weapons were used, where there were no referees, no time limits, and no sense of honor. He fought with a singular focus, to break his opponent in the most efficient way possible. That was his philosophy, and it was what he believed would beat Bruce Lee. Why this wasn't a publicity stunt? For Bruce, public challenges had been part of his rise to fame. But this was different. Lin wasn't looking for fame or glory. There were no cameras waiting to catch his every move, no crowds screaming his name. This was not some stage demonstration or publicity stunt. Lin wasn't interested in winning the public's approval. He wanted to prove something to himself, something deeply personal. Lin had heard the stories of Bruce Lee, how he was supposedly unbeatable, how his speed and precision were unmatched. But to Lin, that was all talk. He had faced men far bigger and more dangerous than Bruce Lee. The thought of being beaten by a man who wasn't a true fighter, according to his standards, stirred something in him, something that demanded he step forward and test this myth in the most direct way possible. What made him credible? Lin had no formal training in any martial arts system, but his reputation as a fighter was well known among the underground circles. He was a man whose skills had been forged in blood and sweat, not in dojo rituals. It was said that in a fight, Lin didn't just fight his opponent. He fought his own fear, his own limits. And the rumors were clear. Lin had never lost a fight in the streets, and he had earned the respect of men who'd seen far more combat than most could imagine. It wasn't just talk. It was the weight of his experience. When Lin entered the room, people didn't see a man who looked like a trained martial artist, but they saw someone who could bring the fight to any level, and more importantly, someone who could survive it. Lin was no fool. He knew what he was up against. Bruce Lee was faster than most, and the world had started to notice him. But Lin didn't believe the hype. He was a man who had faced countless men in the rawest of conditions, and he believed that when it came down to it, the human will to survive and dominate was more important than any technique. This wasn't a battle for Bruce's fame. It was a battle for Lin's ego, and for his belief that there was no man who could stand up to him. The location of the fight was not glamorous. There were no lights, no rings, and no cheering crowds. It took place in a nondescript warehouse in Kowloon, hidden away from the bustling streets and the eyes of the public. The air inside was thick, humid, and smelled of damp concrete, with flickering fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the cracked floor. The space was grimy, nothing more than a skeleton of a building, its walls echoing with the sound of distant traffic and the occasional voice from outside. There were no padded mats, no boxing gloves, just a bare, unforgiving surface that added a certain edge to the danger. The warehouse was nothing more than an abandoned shell, but in that emptiness, it felt more like a cage. The kind of place where men had fought for honor, survival, and pride for centuries. And today, it would play host to a battle where the outcome was uncertain, an environment stripped of anything resembling civility or safety. The stakes felt real, visceral. Rules, or lack of them, there were no rules. No referee, no time limit, no breaks, and no second chances. It was simple, survive. The fight was to go on until one man was unable to continue, and that was it. The absence of any regulation meant that anything could happen. There were no specific techniques that were prohibited, no gentlemen's agreements about the way the fight would unfold. It would be pure, unfiltered combat. This lack of rules was what set the tone for the fight. Bruce Lee, who had always been focused on precision, efficiency, and control, was now faced with a challenge that would force him to rely not just on his philosophy of martial arts, but on his ability to adapt to whatever Lin would throw at him. There were no formalities, no structured combat. It was raw and primal, and the unpredictability was its own form of danger. Witness setup. Only a small handful of people were present, most of them neutral observers, People who had heard whispers of Lin's challenge and were curious to see what would unfold. These weren't Bruce's fans or Lin supporters, but men who had come for one reason: to see if the legend was true, to see if Bruce Lee could back up the stories. There was no cheering, no shouting, just a tense silence that filled the space. The onlookers knew that the outcome of this fight could change how they saw Bruce Lee forever, one way or another. Among the small group of witnesses was a man named Chung Wei, a former martial arts instructor who had recently become disillusioned with the traditional systems. Chung wasn't a close friend of Bruce's, but he respected him as a fellow martial artist. He had heard about the challenge and had shown up out of curiosity. Chung would later become one of the key witnesses who would testify to the nature of the fight, someone who would remember not only the physical movements of the fight, but the atmosphere of raw tension that hung in the air. Emotional atmosphere. There was a suffocating tension in the air, a weight that settled on everyone present. It wasn't the kind of anticipation that comes with a public spectacle. It was the kind that comes with uncertainty, with knowing that something important was about to happen, but not knowing how it would unfold. Bruce Lee, the man who had almost mythic status for his physical abilities, was about to face a test that no one could predict. For Bruce, this was more than just a fight. It was an ideological battle. The atmosphere was thick with the knowledge that if he failed, his entire philosophy, his way of training, and his approach to martial arts could be called into question. It was a confrontation not only with Lin, but with all those who doubted him. And it wasn't lost on Bruce that the way this fight unfolded would have a lasting impact on how he was perceived, not just in Hong Kong, but across the world. Lin, for his part, was excited, but it wasn't a thrill of anticipation, more of a cold, calculating eagerness. He wasn't in this for show. There were no applause awaiting him. This was about proving something, that in the raw, unrefined world of street fighting, Bruce's art was no match for real, visceral combat. His stance was steady, his eyes locked on Bruce with a quiet confidence. He wasn't interested in spectacle. He was interested in one thing: victory. As the two men stood across from each other, the silence was broken only by the hum of the lights overhead, the distant sound of traffic outside, and the quiet breaths of the onlookers. There was no cheering, no banter, just the stillness of a moment that was about to shatter. The tension in the room was more than palpable. It was suffocating, and it seemed to grow with every passing second. There would be no more words now. Only action. The air in the warehouse felt heavier now, almost as if the tension had transformed it into a physical force. The space that had been so quiet moments before now seemed to hum with the energy of two men locked in their own mental preparation, their minds calculating the same inevitable truth: they would fight. Physical realism. Bruce Lee was the first to move. There was no grand display of theatrics, no dramatic stance or bow. Just a single step forward, a sudden shift of weight that was barely perceptible. But Lin was ready. He lunged, his body low and compact, aiming for Bruce with a series of quick jabs. Lin wasn't interested in precision. His strikes were wild and fast, seeking to overwhelm, to force Bruce into reacting. But Bruce didn't react like most fighters would. He moved with a grace that almost made the blows look slow, like water flowing around rocks in a river. The first punch aimed at his face was avoided effortlessly, Bruce's head slipping back just enough for the punch to miss, the air around his face disturbed by the rush of Lin's fist. It was fluid, controlled. Nothing fancy, just a perfect amount of space between his body and Lin's strike. Specific movements. Bruce didn't retreat. He pivoted. With the agility of a man half his size, he shifted to Lin's side in a flash. As Lin continued his relentless advance, Bruce's right leg shot out in a controlled, precise kick aimed at Lin's midsection. The impact was sharp and clean. Bruce's foot met Lin's ribs with the kind of efficiency that left no room for escape. Lin staggered back, briefly losing his balance. Bruce didn't give him time to recover. With a swift, fluid motion, Bruce closed the gap between them, his hands darting forward like a viper. He aimed for Lin's wrist, twisting it sharply to disarm him, but Lin was fast. He responded with a wild, desperate counterattack, using his free arm to throw a looping punch at Bruce's head. Bruce ducked low, the punch barely grazing the top of his head as he slid beneath Lin's extended arm. He countered with a quick jab to Lin's midsection, pushing him back a few more steps, but not with the intent to dominate. No, Bruce's approach was measured. He wasn't looking to overwhelm Lin with brute force. Instead, he was watching, reading, calculating. Speed versus control. Lin's attacks were beginning to slow. His eyes, once filled with the fiery intensity of a man eager to win, now flickered with something else, frustration. The speed and precision of Bruce's movement were beginning to take their toll. Lin's punches were becoming less coordinated, more wild. Each miss an invitation for Bruce to counter. Bruce didn't need to move faster. He needed to move smarter. He didn't care about speed for speed's sake. He cared about efficiency. Every movement had a purpose. Every shift of his body was a statement of control. As Lin's punches came, Bruce's reactions became more calculated. He saw the openings, felt the shifts in Lin's posture before they happened, and used them to his advantage. Clear demonstration of skill shift, and then it happened. Lin, desperate to regain his ground, charged forward with a furious swing, his body committed to the attack. It was a mistake. A single step back from Bruce, followed by a fluid pivot, and Bruce was already in a different position. Lin's momentum carried him forward, but there was no target to hit. Instead, Bruce's right leg swept out in a quick, powerful kick, landing on Lin's hip and sending him crashing sideways to the ground. It wasn't the kind of dramatic takedown that one might expect from a fight in a movie. There was no loud crash, no sweeping flourish. It was a simple, effective move designed to end the exchange without injury. Lin hit the ground hard, but he wasn't out. He was stunned, briefly disoriented, but still conscious, still angry. Bruce didn't press the advantage. He didn't dive in to finish the fight. He stayed back, his chest rising and falling with measured breaths. It was a silent message. I can end this whenever I choose. But Bruce was no fool. He knew that the fight wasn't just about physical dominance. It was a test of willpower, a struggle between two philosophies of combat. And he wasn't about to let Lin off the hook too easily. The fight had shifted. The tension that had once been palpable now felt like something even heavier, something that lingered between the two men. Lin had underestimated Bruce's speed, his precision, and most importantly, his ability to control the flow of combat. Lin's face was flushed with anger, his breath ragged as he struggled to keep up with the relentless pace Bruce had set. Real damage. But this wasn't over. Lin wasn't a man who would quit so easily. His mind was set on one thing, to prove that he could win. With renewed resolve, he surged forward once more, this time with even more aggression, his movements less controlled, more desperate. A wide punch aimed at Bruce's face came first, followed by a brutal knee aimed at his ribs. This time the hit landed. Lin's knee drove into Bruce's side with a sickening thud, knocking the wind out of him. Bruce staggered back, his breath shallow, the sharp pain in his ribs sending a warning signal through his body. It wasn't a serious injury, not yet, but it was a crack in his composure, a small sign of vulnerability. Lin pressed his advantage, rushing in with a series of hard strikes, each one landing with a little more force. Bruce could feel the pressure mounting. His ribs burned, his movements were starting to slow, and the pain from the earlier kick had begun to catch up to him. Bruce pushed close to the edge. This wasn't the controlled sparring that Bruce had grown accustomed to. This was raw, chaotic violence, something that he hadn't fully faced in his past public demonstrations. The moment had arrived when he would have to make a decision. If he allowed Lin to continue pushing, if he didn't end this now, the risk of injury, perhaps even something worse, would grow with each passing second. Bruce could feel his mind racing. There was the risk of injury, yes, but there was also something else, something deeper. Bruce wasn't just fighting Lin. He was fighting his own fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of unleashing the full extent of his power. A power that could cripple or even kill. He had always walked the line between control and chaos, but now that line was beginning to blur. The risk of crossing over was real. And as Lin came at him again, fists flying, Bruce felt it. Something he hadn't anticipated. A flicker of doubt. a crack in the composed mask he had so carefully constructed. Moment of choice. Destroy or control. Lin's wild strike caught Bruce across the shoulder. It wasn't a devastating hit, but it was enough to make Bruce re-evaluate his stance. His first instinct was to retaliate, harder, faster, more decisively. He had the power to end this, to take Lin down and make him stay down. He could break Lin's arm, deliver a knockout blow that would keep him down for good. But in that split second, Bruce hesitated. The crowd, barely audible in the background, was still, waiting. The silence felt like a weight on his shoulders, urging him to act. He could hear the thundering of his own heartbeat in his ears, feel the heat of Lin's breath, the rawness of the fight, and the tension that had built between them. Bruce's body tensed, preparing for the final strike, but then something inside him shifted. He stepped back, allowing Lin's next punch to fly past him. He ducked low and pivoted, using Lin's momentum against him. Instead of delivering the blow that would break Lin, Bruce swept his leg underneath Lin's, guiding him gently to the floor. Lin hit the ground hard, but not with the violence Bruce had once considered. The fight was over, just like that. Lin lay on the cold concrete, gasping for air, his body bruised but not broken. Emotional crack in composure. For a moment, Bruce stood still, his breath heavy. The fight was done, but the inner battle raged on. He had been so close to allowing his own rage to overtake him, to let Lin experience the full weight of his power. But something held him back, a realization that he could fight, he could win, but that didn't mean he had to destroy. It was a fleeting crack in his composure, a moment where Bruce Lee, the calm and calculated fighter, confronted the darker side of his nature. But in the end, he chose control. And in doing so, he made a statement far more powerful than any blow he could have struck. Long-term consequences. Lin stood slowly, his body bruised and aching, but there was no victory in his eyes. He had been defeated, not by Bruce's fists or feet, but by something deeper. The realization hit him as he caught his breath. Bruce Lee was not just a martial artist. He was a man who controlled the fight itself. And that was what had truly broken him. Lin had come expecting raw power and force, but what he got was something far more terrifying, the skill to control violence, to use it only when necessary. As Lin left the warehouse that night, he didn't speak. He didn't challenge Bruce again. He simply walked away, a defeated man, carrying with him a deeper respect for the fighter who had just bested him. Bruce, for his part, didn't speak about the fight either. The witnesses later recalled that he had not been triumphant. He was calm still. His emotions were tightly controlled, as always. But something had changed in Bruce, something they couldn't put into words. How it changed Bruce. Bruce had faced Lin not just physically, but morally. The fight had forced him to confront something that he had long feared, his own potential for destruction. He had always walked the fine line between control and chaos, but this encounter, this test, had made him realize how close he had come to losing himself. The fact that he had stopped himself, held back when he could have ended the fight with a single blow, left him with a lingering question. How much of himself could he control before it consumed him? This moment stayed with Bruce, haunting him in the quietest of moments. It wasn't about the fight. It was about the decision he had made. And that decision would shape not just his future fights, but his philosophy, his approach to life itself. He had won, but the true victory was in what he had chosen to leave behind. In his restraint, Bruce had found a new understanding of his own power. And with that understanding came a quiet, profound responsibility. How witnesses remembered it. Years later, Chung Wei, one of the few men present that day, would reflect on what he had witnessed. He would say, Bruce Lee was more than just a fighter that night. He was a man who had been tested by something real, something raw, and he chose not to destroy. The witnesses, some of whom had doubted Bruce before the fight, were now silent. They had seen something that few had ever witnessed, a fighter who, despite his overwhelming skill, chose to walk away from the edge. And for them, that moment, that quiet decision, spoke more than any victory could. Quote-worthy closing line. The strongest man isn't the one who wins every time. It's the one who knows exactly how much damage he chose not to do.